Chapters 33 through 34 of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D., by Robert F Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Richardson. Chapter 33. Caesar's operations in Egypt, Asia, Africa, and Spain. Pompey, in his flight from Pharsalia, hastened by the shortest way to the sea, and, seeing a vessel weighing anchor, embarked with a few companions who had accompanied him in his flight. He went to Mytilene, and from there to Egypt, hoping to obtain an asylum with young Ptolemy. But he was seized upon his arrival and beheaded. 28 September 48. Just before his death, Pompey had completed his 58th year. Though he had some great and good qualities, he hardly deserved the surname of great. He was certainly a good soldier, and is said to have excelled in all athletic sports, but he fell short of being a first-class general. He won great successes in Spain, and more especially in the East, but for these he was, no doubt, partly indebted to what others had already done. Of the gifts which make a good statesman, he had really none. He was too weak and irresolute to choose a side and stand by it. Pitted against such a man as Caesar, he could not but fail. But to his credit be it said, that in a corrupt time he never used his opportunities for plunder and extortion. End of quote. Meanwhile, Caesar, pursuing his victory with indefatigable activity, set sail for Egypt. Upon his arrival, the head of his enemy was brought to him. He turned from the sight with tears in his eyes. The murderers now saw what would be their fate. Ptolemy was at variance with his sister, the famous Cleopatra. Caesar sided with her. The inhabitants of Alexandria revolted and besieged Caesar in the palace, but with a handful of soldiers he bravely baffled their attacks. Setting fire to the neighboring buildings, he escaped to his ships. Afterward he returned and wreaked vengeance upon the Alexandrians, establishing Cleopatra upon the throne. Satisfied with this vengeance, Caesar left Egypt and went to Pontus, where Pharnaces, son of Mithridates, was inciting a revolt against Rome. Caesar attacked and defeated him at Zela in 47, with a rapidity rendered proverbial by his words, Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. He now passed quickly down the Hellespont, and had landed in Italy before it was known that he had left Pontus. During his absence from the capital, there had been some minor disturbances, but the mass of the citizens were firmly attached to him. Few could distrust the genius and fortune of the irresistible conqueror. In October of 48, he had been made dictator a second time and appointed tribune for life. Caesar's return in September 47 was marked by no proscription. He insisted that all debts should be paid and the rights of property respected. He restored quiet, and after a brief stay of 3 months prepared to transport his army to Africa. The army was in Campania, but discontented and mutinous because of not receiving the expected privilege of pillage and plunder. They refused to move until certain promised rewards were received. The 10th Legion broke out into open revolt, and marched from Campania to Rome to obtain their rights. Caesar collected them in the Campus Martins, and asked them to state their grievances. They demanded their discharge. "I grant it, citizens." "Quirites," said the Imperator. Heretofore he had always addressed them as fellow soldiers, and the implied rebuke was so keen that a reaction at once began, and they all begged to be received again into his service. He accepted them, telling them that lands had been allotted to each soldier out of the Ager Publicus, or out of his own estates. Africa must now be subdued. Since the defeat and death of Curio, King Juba had found no one to dispute his authority. Around him now rallied all the followers of Pompey: Metellus, Scipio, Cato, Labienus, Afranius, Petreius, and the slain general's two sons, Sextus and Gnaeus Pompeius. Utica was made their headquarters. Here Cato collected 13 legions of troops of miscellaneous character. Raids were made upon Sicily, Sardinia, and the coast of Italy. Caesar's officers, if captured, were put to death without mercy. Cicero alone of the old Pompeian party protested against such cruelties. He remained in Italy, was denounced by them as a traitor, and charged with currying favor of the dictator. Caesar sailed from Lilybaeum, December 19, effected a landing near Leptis, and maintained himself in a fortified position until he formed useful alliances among the Mauritanians. Many Roman residents in the province came to him indignant at Metellus, Scipio's promise to Juba to give the province to him in case of success. Many deserters also came in, and raised that precedence was given to Juba over Scipio in councils of war. But the enemy's army was kept full of new recruits, sent from Utica by Cato. For 3 months Caesar failed to bring on the desired engagement. Scipio had learned caution from Pompey's experience at Pharsalia. Finally, at Thapsus, 100 miles southeast of Carthage, April 4, 46, the armies met. Caesar's men were so enthusiastic that they rushed to the charge with one impulse. There was no real battle, but rather a slaughter. Officers and men fled for their lives. Scipio was intercepted in his flight and slain. Juba and Petreius fled together, but, finding their retreat cut off, engaged, it is said, in mortal combat. When the first, Petreius, fell, the other threw himself on his own sword. Labienus and the two sons of Pompey managed to escape to Spain. Afranius was captured and executed. Cato, when he heard of the defeat, retired to his chamber in Utica and committed suicide. Thus ended the African campaign. On his return from Africa, Caesar celebrated 4 triumphs on 4 successive days: one over the Gauls, one over Ptolemy of Egypt, one over Pharnaces, and one over Juba. He gratified his armed followers with liberal gifts, and pleased the people by his great munificence. They were feasted at a splendid banquet, at which were 22,000 tables, each table having 3 couches, and each couch 3 persons. Then followed shows in the circus and theatre, combats of wild beasts and gladiators, in which the public especially delighted. Honors were now heaped upon Caesar without stint. A thanksgiving of 40 days was decreed. His statue was placed in the Capitol. Another was inscribed to Caesar, the demagogue. A golden chair was allotted to him in the Senate House. The name of the 5th month, Quintilius, of the Roman calendar was changed to Julius July. He was appointed dictator for 2 years, and later for life. He received for 3 years the office of censor, which enabled him to appoint senators and to be guardian of manners and morals. He had already been made tribune in 48 for life, and Pontifex Maximus in 63. In a word, he was king in everything excepting name. Caesar's most remarkable and durable reform at this period was the revision of the calendar. The Roman method of reckoning time had been so inaccurate that now their seasons were more than 2 months behind. Caesar established a calendar, which, with slight changes, is still in use. It went in operation January 1st, 45. He employed Sosthenes, an Alexandrian astronomer, to superintend the reform. While Sosthenes was at work on the calendar, Caesar purified the Senate. Many who were guilty of extortion and corruption were expelled, and the vacancies filled with persons of merit. Meanwhile, matters in Spain were not satisfactory. After the battle of Pharsalia, Cassius Longimus, Trebonius, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus had been sent to govern the province. They could not agree. The soldiers became mutinous. To Spain flocked all who were dissatisfied with Roman affairs. The remnant of Scipio's African army rested there in its wanderings. Thus Labienus and Pompey's 2 sons managed to collect an army as numerous as that which had been defeated at Thapsus. There were 13 legions in all. Caesar saw that he must make one more struggle. He set out for the province accompanied by his nephew Octavius, afterward the Emperor Augustus, and by his trusted friend and officer Decimus Brutus. The struggle in Spain was protracted for several months, but the decisive battle was fought at Munda, 17 March 45, on the Guadalquivir, near Cordova. The forces were well matched. The advantage in position was on the side of the enemy. The battle was stubbornly fought, most of it hand to hand, with short swords. So equal was the struggle, so doubtful at one time the issue, that Caesar himself sprang from his horse, seized a standard, and rallied a wavering legion. Finally, Labienus was seen to gallop across the field. It was thought he was fleeing. Panic seized his troops. They broke and ran. 30,000 were slain, including 3,000 Roman knights and Labienus himself. Gnaeus Pompey shortly after lost his life, but Sextus lived for a number of years. Caesar tarried in Spain, regulating affairs until late in the autumn, when he returned to Rome and enjoyed another triumph over the Iberians, the Spaniards. The triumph was followed, as usual, by games and festivals, which kept the populace in a fever of delight and admiration. Cato Metellus Scipio. Marcus Portius Cato Utensis, footnote: Cato the Younger, called Utensis on account of his death at Utica in 95-46. End of footnote. Was the great-grandson of Cato the Censor. He was the last of the Romans of the old school. Like his more famous ancestor, he was frugal and austere in his habits, upright, unselfish, and incorruptible. But he was a fanatic who could not be persuaded to relinquish his views on any subject. As a general, he was a failure, having neither taste nor genius for military exploits. He held various offices at Rome, as quaestor and praetor, but when candidate for the consulship he was defeated, because he declined to win the votes by bribery and other questionable methods then in vogue. Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius belonged to the illustrious family of the Scipios by birth, and to that of the Metelli by adoption. He was one of the most unjust and dishonest of the senators that opposed Caesar. He was the father-in-law of Pompey, by whom he was made a pliant tool against the great conqueror. Chapter 34. Murder of Caesar. Upon his return from Spain, Caesar granted pardon to all who had fought against him, the most prominent of whom were Gaius, Cassius, Marcus Brutus, and Cicero. He increased the number of the Senate to 900. He cut off the corn grants, which nursed the city mob in idleness. He sent out impoverished men to colonize old cities. He rebuilt Corinth and settled 80,000 Italians on the site of Carthage. As a censor of morals, he was very rigid. His own habits were marked by frugality. The rich young patricians were forbidden to be carried about in litters, as had been the custom. Libraries were formed. Eminent physicians and scientists were encouraged to settle in Rome. The harbor of Ostia was improved, and a road constructed from the Adriatic to the Tyrrhenian Sea, over the Pennines. A temple to Mars was built, and an immense amphitheater was erected at the foot of the Tarpeian rock. In the midst of this useful activity he was basely murdered. Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus were the leaders in the conspiracy to effect Caesar's death. Cassius, the former lieutenant of Crassus, had shown great bravery in the war with the Parthians. At Pharsalia he fought on the side of Pompey, but was afterward pardoned by Caesar. He was married to a sister Brutus, the latter nephew and son-in-law of Cato, and also fought at Pharsalia against Caesar, and also been pardoned by him. Cassius, it was said, hated the tyrant and Brutus' tyranny. These conspirators were soon joined by persons of all parties, and men who had fought against each other in the civil war now joined hands. Cicero was not taken into the plot. He was of advanced years, and all who knew him must have felt that he would never consent to the taking of the life of one who had been so lenient towards his conquered enemies. On the morning of the Ides 15th of March, in 44, as Caesar entered the Senate and took his seat, he was approached by the conspirators, headed by Tullius Cimber, prayed for the pardon of his exiled brother, and while the rest joined him in the request, he, grasping Caesar's hand, kissed his head and breast. As Caesar attempted to rise, Cimber dragged his cloak from his shoulders, and Casca, who was standing behind his chair, stabbed him in the neck. The first blow was struck, and the whole pack fell upon their noble victim. Cassius stabbed him in the face, and Marcus Brutus in the groin. He made no further resistance, but wrapping his gown over his head and the lower part of his body, he fell at the base of Pompey's statue, which was drenched with the martyr's blood. Great tumult and commotion followed, and in their alarm most of the senators fled. It was 2 days before the Senate met. The conspirators, meanwhile, having taken refuge in the Capitol, public sentiment was against them. Many of Caesar's old soldiers were in the city, and many more were flocking there from all directions. The funeral oration of Mark Antony over the remains produced a deep impression upon the crowd. They became so excited when the speaker removed the dead man's toga and disclosed his wounds, that, instead of allowing the body to be carried to the Campus Martius for burial, they raised a funeral pile in the Forum, and there burned it. The crowd then dispersed in troops, broke into and destroyed the houses of the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fled from the city for their lives, followed by other murderers. As a general, Caesar was probably superior to all others excepting possibly Hannibal. He was especially remarkable for the fertility of his resources. It has been said that Napoleon taught his enemies how to conquer him. But Caesar's enemies never learned how to conquer him, because he had not a mere system of tactics, but a new stratagem for every emergency. He was, however, not only a great general, but a preeminent statesman and second only to Cicero in eloquence. As a historian, he wrote in a style that was clear, vigorous, and also simple. Most of his writings are lost, but of those that remain, Cicero said that fools might try to improve on them, but no wise man could attempt it. End of chapter 34.
Chapters 35 and 36 of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D., by Robert F. Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. The Second Triumvirate, Philippi and Actium. Caesar, in his will, had appointed Gaius Octavius, the grandson of his sister Julia, heir to 3/4 of his property, and his other relatives were to have the remaining fourth. Young Octavius was in his 19th year when Caesar was murdered. He went at once to Rome to claim his inheritance. Caesar's widow, Calpurnia, had entrusted to Mark Antony all the money in the house, a large sum, and had also delivered to his care all the dictator's writings and memoranda. Octavius was cool and sagacious, without passion or affection, and showed himself a match for all his opponents. His arrival at Rome was disagreeable to Antony, who was unwilling to surrender Caesar's property. He claimed that he had already expended it for public purposes. Octavius at once paid the dead dictator's legacies, mostly out of his own fortune, thus making himself very popular among the people. He then joined the party of the Senate, and during the autumn and winter of 44 was its chief champion. He was helped by the eloquent Cicero, who was delivering against Antony his famous 14 Philippics, so called from their resemblance to the great orations of Demosthenes against Philip. During the spring of 43, Octavius advanced against Antony, who was at Mutina (Modena), and defeated him in 2 battles. He was then appointed consul, and finding it for his interest, he deserted the Senate, made friends with Antony, and with him and Lepidus formed, November 27, 43, the Second Triumvirate, assuming full authority to govern and reorganize the state, and to hold office for 5 years. The provinces were divided as follows: Lepidus was to have Spain and Gallia Narbonensis; Antony the rest of Gaul beyond the Alps and Gallia Cisalpina; Octavius Sicily, Sardinia, and Africa. A bloody proscription followed. Among its victims were Cicero, who was surrendered to please Antony, 300 senators, and 2,000 equites. Philippi and Actium. The Triumvirs could now concentrate their energies upon the East, whither Brutus and Cassius, the murderers of Caesar, had fled. These two had organized in the provinces of the East an army amounting to 80,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. They were employed in plundering various towns of Asia Minor, and finally, in the spring of 42, assembled their forces at Sardis, preparatory to an invasion of Europe. After marching through Thrace, they entered Macedonia, and found Antony and Octavius opposed to them at Philippi, with an army of 120,000 troops. There were 2 battles at Philippi in November 42. In the first, Brutus defeated Octavius, but Cassius was defeated by Antony. and unaware of his colleague's victory, committed suicide. In the second battle, 3 weeks later, Brutus was defeated by the united armies of the Triumvirs, and, following the example of Cassius, put an end to his life. With Brutus fell the Republic. The absolute ascendancy of individuals, which is monarchy, was then established. The immediate result of Philippi was a fresh arrangement of the Roman world among the Triumvirs. Antony preferred the East. Octavius took Italy and Spain, and Africa fell to Lepidus. Octavius tried to establish order in Italy, but many obstacles were to be overcome. Sextus Pompeius, who had escaped from Munda, was in command of a strong naval force. He controlled a large part of the Mediterranean, and by waylaying the corn ships bound for Rome, exposed the city to great danger from famine. Octavius was obliged to raise a fleet and meet this danger. At first he was defeated by Pompey, but later, in 36, in the great sea fight off Naulochus in Sicily, the rebel was overcome. He fled to Asia with a few followers, but was taken prisoner at Miletus by one of the lieutenants of Antony, and put to death. Lepidus now claimed Sicily as a part of his province, and an equal share in the government of the Roman world with the other Triumvirs. But his soldiers were induced to desert him, and he was obliged to surrender to Octavius. His life was spared, but he was deprived of his power and provinces. He lived 20 years longer, until 13, but ceased to be a factor in public affairs. Having rid themselves of all rivals, Octavius and Antony redivided the empire, the former taking the west, the latter the east. Antony now repaired to Alexandria, and surrendered himself to the fascinations of the famous Cleopatra. He assumed the habits and dress of an Eastern monarch, and by his senseless follies disgusted his friends and supporters. He resigned himself to luxury and idleness, and finally divorced himself from his wife Octavia, sister of Octavius, disregarding his good name and the wishes of his friends. Thus, gradually, he became more and more estranged from Octavius, until finally the rupture resulted in open war. The contest was decided by the naval battle off Cape Actium in Greece, September 2, 31. Antony had collected from all parts of the East a large army, in addition to his fleet, which was supported by that of Cleopatra. He wished to decide the contest on land, but Cleopatra insisted that they should fight by sea. The fleet of Octavius was commanded by Agrippa, who had been in command at the sea fight off Naulochus. The battle lasted a long time, and was still undecided when Cleopatra hoisted sail, and with her 60 vessels hastened to leave the line. Antony at once followed her. The battle, however, continued until his remaining fleet was destroyed, and his army, after a few days' hesitation, surrendered. Octavius did not follow Antony for about a year. He passed the winter in Samos, sending Agrippa to Italy with the veterans. His time was occupied in restoring order in Greece and Asia, in raising money to satisfy the demands of his troops, and in founding new colonies. At length he turned his attention to Egypt. After capturing Pelusium, the key of the country, he marched upon Alexandria. Antony, despairing of success, committed suicide, expiring in the arms of Cleopatra. The queen, disdaining to adorn the triumph of the conqueror, followed his example, and was found dead on her couch in royal attire, with her 2 faithful attendants also dead at her feet. Octavius was now sole ruler of Rome. Before returning to the capital to celebrate his triumphs, he organized Egypt as a province, settled disputes in Judea, and arranged matters in Syria and Asia Minor. He arrived at Rome August 29, and enjoyed three magnificent triumphs. The gates of the Temple of Janus, which were open in time of war, and had been closed but twice before, once during Numa's reign, and once between the first and second Punic Wars, were closed, and Rome was at peace with all the world. Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero's public life covered a period of nearly 40 years, from the dictatorship of Sulla to the fall of the Republic. Although endowed by nature with great talents, he was always under the sway of the moment, and therefore little qualified to be a statesman. Yet he had not sufficient self-knowledge to see it. Hence the attempts he made to play a part in politics served only to lay bare his utter weakness. Thus it happened that he was used and then pushed aside, attracted and repelled, deceived by the weakness of his friends and the strength of his adversaries, and at last threatened by both the parties between which he tried to steer his course. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36. Augustus, 30 B.C. to 14 A.D. After enjoying his triple triumph, Octavius should, according to the precedents of the Republic, have given up the title of Imperator, but he allowed the Senate, which was only too glad to flatter him, to give him that name for 10 years, a period which was repeatedly renewed. In this way he became permanent commander of the national forces. Next, the Imperator (Emperor) caused himself to be invested with the authority of censor. This enabled him to revise the list of senators, and to restore to this body something of its ancient respectability. By judicious pruning he reduced the number to 600, and required a property qualification for membership. He placed himself at its head as Princeps (prince), a title which implied that the Emperor was the first citizen, without claiming any rights of royalty, thus lulling any suspicions of the populace. The Senate still decided the most important questions. It had jurisdiction in criminal matters, and the right of ratifying new laws. It was convened 3 times each month, namely, on the 1st, 5th or 7th, and 13th or 15th. The Emperor voted with the other senators. The Senate next conferred upon Octavius the title of Augustus. Then it made him proconsul, an officer with the right to govern provinces, and consul, with the privilege of having 12 lictors, and of sitting in the curial chair between the 2 consuls. The regular consuls, of course, were only too ready to follow his wishes. Finally, he was made Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Roman religion. Augustus was now supreme ruler in fact, if not in name. The Senate was practically subject to his will. The assemblies gradually lost all voice in the government, and finally disappeared entirely. The Senate, however, continued nominally to act until the time of Diocletian, 284 A.D. As Augustus had exclusive command of the armies, he chose to govern as proconsul those provinces which required military forces. He himself resided at the capital, and sent deputies (legati) to oversee them. The other provinces, called senatorial, were governed by proconsuls appointed by the Senate. These were at this time Sicily, Africa, Achaia (Greece), Macedonia, Asia Minor, Hispania Ulterior, and Gallia Narbonensis. The city government now included all Italy. In this Augustus was assisted by 3 prefects, one in charge of the corn supplies, a second in charge of the city proper, and a third in charge of his bodyguard of 9,000 men, called the Praetorian Guard. These prefects soon overshadowed all the regular magistrates, and through them Augustus reigned supreme. The Roman Empire at this time included all the countries bordering on the Mediterranean, extending east to the Parthian kingdom, the upper Euphrates, and the Arabian desert, south to the desert of Sahara, and west to the Atlantic Ocean. On the north, the boundary was unsettled and subject to inroads of barbarians. In the early part of his reign, Augustus joined to the empire a new province, Moesia, comprising the territory along the lower Danube, and making 19 in all. Augustus next devoted himself to the task of conquering the territory between the lower Rhine and Moesia, which was occupied by hardy mountaineers whose resistance was likely to be stubborn. His 2 stepsons, Drusus and Tiberius, were in charge of this important work. They were so successful as to acquire enough territory to form 2 new provinces, Rhaetia and Noricum, 15 B.C. Tiberius also conquered the valley of the Save, and made it the province of Pannonia, western Hungary, 10 B.C. Drusus, while his brother Tiberius was engaged in Pannonia, made a campaign against the Germans near the Rhine. He had nearly finished the conquest of Germany from the Rhine to the Elbe when he died, 9 B.C., and was succeeded by his brother Tiberius, who completed his work. Drusus received the cognomen of Germanicus for his conquests in Germany. His wife was Antonia, daughter of Mark Antony, by whom he had 2 sons, Germanicus and Claudius, the latter of whom was afterwards emperor. In 7 A.D., Lucius Varus was appointed governor of the newly acquired territory in Germany. When he endeavored to subject these recently conquered peoples to the forms of the Roman provincial government, they rose in rebellion under the lead of Arminius Hermann, a powerful chief. Varus was allured from his fortified camp, 9 A.D., into a pass in the Teutoburger forests, where he was suddenly attacked on all sides. After 3 days' fighting, he succeeded with great loss in making his way through the pass into the open plain, but was there met by the enemy in full force, and his troops were annihilated. In despair, Varus killed himself. Germany was practically lost, and the Rhine became again the Roman frontier. This defeat caused a great stir at Rome, and the Emperor is said to have exclaimed in his sorrow, "Varus, Varus, give me back my legions." 5 years later, 14 A.D., Augustus died. In his last moments he asked his friends if he had not played well his part in the comedy of life. Although married 3 times, the Emperor had but one child, Julia, 39 B.C. to 14 A.D., by his second wife, Scribonia. She was noted for her beauty and talents, but infamous for her intrigues. She was married 3 times, first to Marcellus, her cousin; secondly to Agrippa, by whom she had 5 children; and thirdly to the Emperor Tiberius. She was banished on account of her conduct, and died in want. Octavia, the sister of Augustus, was noted for her beauty and accomplishments, as well as for the nobility of her character. Her son, Marcellus, was adopted by his uncle, but died young, 23 B.C. The famous lines of Virgil upon this promising young man Aeneid VI. (869 887) were read before the Emperor and his sister, moving them to tears, and winning for the author a munificent reward. After the death of her first husband, Octavia was married to Mark Antony, by whom she had two daughters, through whom she was the ancestress of three emperors, Claudius, Caligula, and Nero. Agrippa (63 12), an eminent general and statesman, was a warm friend and counsellor of Augustus. At the battle of Actium he commanded the fleet of Octavius. He married Julia, the only daughter of the Emperor, and had three sons, two of whom were adopted by Augustus, but died before him. The third was murdered by Tiberius. Augustus died at the age of 76. He was frugal and correct in his personal habits, quick and shrewd in his dealings with men, bold and ambitious in the affairs of state. His greatness consisted rather in the ability to abstain from abusing the advantages presented by fortune, than in the genius which molds the current of affairs to the will. His success depended on the temper of the people and the peculiar circumstances of the time. His clearest title to greatness is found in the fact that he compelled 80 millions of people to live in peace for more than 40 years. He made the world to center on one will, and the horrors which mark the reigns of his successors were the legitimate result of the irresponsible sovereignty he established. He formed his empire for the present, to the utter ignoring of the future. Thus it would seem that the part he played was that of a shrewd politician rather than that of a wise statesman. End of chapter 36. End of section 14. Chapters 37 and 38 of History of Rome, from the earliest times down to 476 A.D. by Robert F. Pennell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. The Augustan Age. In speaking of Augustus, we must take into account the writers whose names have given to his its brightest lustre, and have made the Augustan age a synonym for excellence in culture, art, and government. Virgil, Ovid, Horace, Livy, and a host of others have given his reign a brilliancy unmatched in time, which is rather enhanced than diminished by the fame of Cicero, Caesar, and Sallust, who preceded, and that of Tacitus, Seneca, and others who followed, for they belong to an epoch in which Augustus stands the central figure in all which pertains to the arts of peace. In literature, the name of Virgil stands first in the Augustan age. Born at Andes, near Mantua, October 15, 70, he was educated at Cremona and Mediolanum. After completing his education, he retired to his paternal estate. In the division of land among the soldiers after the battle of Philippi, 42, he was deprived of his property, which was subsequently restored to him by Augustus. He lived partly at Rome, partly in Campania. His health was never good, and he died in his 52nd year, September 22, 19 B.C. Virgil had neither original nor creative genius. Though he mainly imitated Greek poetry, his style is graceful and eloquent, his tone inspiring and elevating. In disposition he was childlike, innocent, and amiable, a good son, a faithful friend, honest, and full of devotion to persons and ideal interests. He was not, however, fitted to grapple with the tasks and difficulties of practical life. In his fortunes and friends he was a happy man. Munificent patronage gave him ample means of enjoyment and leisure, and he had the friendship of all the most accomplished men of his day, among whom was Horace, who entertained a strong affection for him. His fame, which was established in his lifetime, was cherished after his death as an inheritance in which every Roman had a share, and his works became school books even before the death of Augustus, and have continued such ever since. Horace, 65 8 B.C., was born at Venusia, but received his education at Rome and Athens. He was present at the Battle of Philippi, 42, where he fought as tribune under Brutus. His first writings were his satires. These he read to his friends, and their merit was at once recognized. His great patron was Maecenas, who introduced him to the Emperor, and gave him a fine country seat near Tivoli, among the Sabine mountains. He died the same year as his patron, and was buried beside him at the Esquiline Gate. The poems of Horace give us a picture of refined and educated life in the Rome of his time. They are unsurpassed in gracefulness and felicity of thought. Filled with truisms, they were for centuries read and quoted more than those of any other ancient writer. Ovid, 43 B.C. to 18 A.D., a native of Sulmo, is far inferior to Virgil and Horace as a poet, but ranks high on account of his great gift for narration. Of the Latin poets he stands perhaps nearest to modern civilization, partly on account of his fresh and vivid sense of the beauties of nature, and partly because his subject is love. His representations of this passion are graceful and strikingly true. He also excelled other poets in the perfect elegance of his form, especially in the character and rhythm of his verses. He spent his last days in exile, banished by Augustus for some reason now unknown. Some of his most pleasing verses were written during this period. One of the most noted men of the Augustan age was Maecenas, the warm friend and adviser of Augustus. He was a constant patron of the literature and art of his generation. He was very wealthy, and his magnificent house was the center of literary society in Rome. He helped both Virgil and Horace in a substantial manner, and the latter is constantly referring to him in his poetry. He died 8 B.C., childless, and left his fortune to Augustus. The prose writers who lived at this period were Livy, Sallust, and Nepos. Livy is the best of these. He was a native of Patavium, Padua, a man of rhetorical training, who spent most of his time in Rome. The historical value of his work cannot be overestimated, on account of the scarcity, and in many cases the utter lack of other historical documents on the times of which he wrote. His style is spirited and always interesting. His accuracy, however, is not to be compared with that of Caesar. Only 35 out of the 142 books that he wrote are preserved. Nepos was a prolific writer, but only a portion of one of his works, De Viris Illustribus, has come down to us. It is neither accurate nor interesting, and of little value. Sallust left 2 historical productions, one on the conspiracy of Catiline, the other on the war with Jugurtha. His style is rhetorical. He excels in delineating character, but he is often so concise as to be obscure. Gaius Asinius Pollio was a statesman and orator of marked attainments of this time. He was strongly attached to the old republican institutions, a man of great independence of character, and a poet of no mean merit, as his contemporaries testify. Unfortunately, none of his writings are preserved. The age of Augustus is also noted for the architectural improvements in Rome. Augustus is said to have found a city of stone and left one of marble. He himself built 12 temples, and repaired 82 that had fallen into decay. The Forum was beautified by 5 halls of justice (basilica), which were erected around its borders. The most famous of these was the Basilica Julia, begun by Julius Caesar and finished by Augustus. Public squares were planned and begun north of the great Forum, the finest of which was the Forum of Trajan, finished by the Emperor of that name. The finest building outside of the city, in the Campus Martius, was the Pantheon, built by Agrippa, and now used as a Christian church. Here are buried many distinguished men. Near by, Augustus erected a mausoleum for himself. Here, too, was a theatre, built by Pompey, the first stone theatre of Rome. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38. The Julian and Claudian Emperors. Tiberius, 14 to 37 A.D. Augustus was succeeded by Tiberius Claudius Nero Caesar, born 42 B.C., the son of Tiberius Claudius Nero and Livia. His mother obtained a divorce from Tiberius and married Augustus. Tiberius had great military talent. He was a severe disciplinarian, and commanded the full confidence of his soldiers. As commander in Cantabria, Armenia, Rhaetia, Dalmatia, and Germany, he conducted his campaigns with success and honor to himself. Returning to Rome in 7 B.C., he celebrated a triumph, and afterwards married Julia, the dissolute daughter of Augustus. This marriage proved to be the ruin of Tiberius, developing everything that was bad in his character, and making him jealous, suspicious, and hypocritical. Augustus, not relishing the changes in his character, sent him to Rhodes, where he lived 7 years in retirement. Through his mother's influence, however, he was recalled in 2 A.D., and was afterwards appointed the Emperor's successor. He ascended the throne at the age of 56, a silent man. All his feelings, desires, and ambitions were locked behind an impenetrable barrier. He is said but once to have taken counsel with his officers. He was a master of dissimulation, and on this account an object of dislike and suspicion. But until his later years his intellect was clear and far-seeing, penetrating all disguises. Throughout his reign, Tiberius strove to do his duty to the empire at large, and maintained with great care the constitutional forms which had been established by Augustus. Only 2 changes of importance were made. First, the imperial guard, hitherto seen in the city only in small bodies, was permanently encamped in full force close to the walls. By this course the danger of riots was much lessened. Secondly, the old comitias were practically abolished, but the Senate was treated with great deference. Tiberius expended great care on the provinces. His favorite maxim was, that a good shepherd should shear and not flay his sheep. Soldiers, governors, and officials of all kinds were kept in a wholesome dread of punishment if they oppressed those under them. Strict economy in public expenses kept the taxes down. Commerce was cherished, and his reign on the whole was one of prosperity for the empire. Tiberius was noted especially for prosecutions for majestas on the slightest pretext. Majestas nearly corresponds to treason, but it is more comprehensive. One of the offenses included in the word was effecting, aiding in, or planning the death of a magistrate, or of one who had the imperium or potestas. Tiberius stretched the application of this offense even to words, or conduct which could in any way be considered dangerous to the Emperor. A hateful class of informers, delatores, sprung up, and the lives of all were rendered unsafe. The dark side of this ruler's character is made specially prominent by ancient historians, but their statements are beginning to be taken with much allowance. After a reign of 23 years, Tiberius died, either in a fainting fit or from violence, at the age of 79. Livia, the mother of Tiberius, deserves more than a passing notice. She exercised almost a boundless influence on her husband Augustus. She had great ambition, and was very cruel and unscrupulous. She managed to ruin, one after another, the large circle of relatives of Augustus, until finally the aged Emperor found himself alone in the palace with Livia and her son Tiberius. All Rome execrated the Empress, and her son feared and hated her. She survived Augustus 15 years, and died in 29. Tiberius refused to visit her on her deathbed, and was not present at her funeral. Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard of Tiberius. He was trusted fully by the Emperor, but proved to be a deep-dyed rascal. He persuaded Livilla, the daughter-in-law of the Emperor, to poison her husband, the heir apparent, and then he divorced his own wife to marry her. He so maligned Agrippina, the widow of Germanicus and daughter of Agrippa and Julia, that Tiberius banished her, with her sons Nero and Drusus. In 26 he induced the Emperor to retire to the island of Capri, and he himself became the real master of Rome. Tiberius at last finding out his true character, Sejanus was arrested and executed in 31. His body was dragged through the streets, torn in pieces by the mob, and thrown into the Tiber. Caligula, 37 41. Tiberius having left no son, the Senate recognized Gaius Caesar, son of Germanicus and Agrippina, grandson of Julia, and great-grandson of Augustus, as Emperor. He is better known as Caligula, a nickname given him by the soldiers from the buskins he wore. He was 25 years of age when he began to reign, of weak constitution and subject to fits. After squandering his own wealth, he killed rich citizens and confiscated their property. He seemed to revel in bloodshed, and is said to have expressed a wish that the Roman people had but one neck, that he might slay them all at a blow. He was passionately fond of adulation, and often repaired to the Capitoline temple in the guise of a god, and demanded worship. 4 years of such a tyrant was enough. He was murdered by a tribune of his Praetorian Guard. The Claudian emperors, Claudius, 41 54. A strong party was now in favor of returning to a republican form of government. But while the Senate was considering this question, the Praetorian Guard settled it by proclaiming Claudius emperor. Claudius was the uncle of Caligula and the nephew of Tiberius. He was a man of learning and good parts, but a glutton, and the slave of his 2 wives, who were both bad women. His first wife, Messalina, was so notorious that her name has become almost a synonym for wickedness. His second wife, his niece Agrippina, sister of Caligula, was nearly as bad. This woman had by her former husband, Domitius, a son whom she induced the Emperor to adopt under the name of Nero. The faithless wife then caused her husband to be poisoned, and her son to be proclaimed emperor. At Rome the rule of Claudius was mild, and on the whole beneficial. In the government of the provinces he was rigorous and severe. He undertook the conquest of Britain, and in a campaign of 16 days he laid the foundation of its final subjugation, which occurred about 40 years later, under the noted general Agricola. It remained a Roman province for 400 years, but the people never assimilated Roman customs as did the Gauls, and when the Roman garrisons were withdrawn, they quickly returned to their former condition. However, many remains of Roman buildings in the island show that it was for the time well under subjection. The public works of Claudius were on a grand scale. He constructed a new harbor at the mouth of the Tiber, and built the great aqueduct called the Aqua Claudia, the ruined arches of which can be seen to this day. He also reclaimed for agriculture a large tract of land by draining the Fucine Lake. Nero, 54 68. Nero was but 16 years old when he began to reign. For 2 or 3 years he was under the influence of his tutor Seneca, the author, and Burrus, the Prefect of the Praetorian Guard, and his government was during this period the most respectable of any since the time of Augustus. His masters kept the young Emperor amused, and removed from the cares of state, but he soon became infatuated with an unscrupulous woman, Poppaea Sabina, for whom he neglected and finally killed his wife Octavia. It would be useless to follow in detail the crimes of Nero from this time. A freedman, Tigellinus, became his adviser, and was the real ruler of the empire. He encouraged his master in all his vices and wickedness. Poppaea died from a kick administered by Nero in anger. Burrus was disposed of. Agrippina and Britannicus, the true heir to the throne, were murdered. The wealthy were plundered, and the feelings of his subjects outraged in every conceivable manner. The Emperor appeared in public, contending first as a musician, and afterwards in the sports of the circus. The great fire of July 18, 64, which destroyed a large part of the city, was ascribed to him, but without sufficient evidence, and the stories of his conduct during the conflagration are doubtless pure fictions. It was necessary, however, to fix the guilt on some one, so the Christians, then a small sect, made up chiefly of the poorer people, were accused of the crime, and persecuted without mercy. They were often enclosed in faggots covered with pitch, and burned alive. In rebuilding Rome, Nero took every precaution against the recurrence of a conflagration. Broad, regular streets replaced the narrow, winding alleys. The new houses were limited in height, built partly of hard stone, and protected by open spaces and colonnades. The water supply was also carefully regulated. In addition to rebuilding the city, Nero gratified his love for the magnificent by erecting a splendid palace called the Golden House. Its walls were adorned with gold, precious stones, and masterpieces of art from Greece. The grounds around were marvelous in their meadows, lakes, groves, and distant views. In front was a colossal statue of Nero himself, 110 feet high. Conspiracies having been formed in which Seneca and Lucan were implicated, both men were ordered to take their own lives. Nero's life after this became still more infamous. In a tour made in Greece, he conducted himself so scandalously that even Roman morals were shocked, and Roman patience could endure him no longer. The governor of Hither Spain, Galba, proclaimed himself emperor and marched upon Rome. Virginius, the governor of Upper Germany, also lent his aid to the insurrection. The Senate proclaimed Nero a public enemy, and condemned him to death. He fled from the city and put an end to his life, June 9, 68, just in time to escape capture. His statues were broken down, his name everywhere erased, and his golden house demolished. With him ended the Claudian line of emperors. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, 8 B.C. to 65 A.D., was born at Corduba in Spain, of a Spanish Roman family, and was educated at Rome. His father was a teacher of rhetoric, a man of wealth and literary attainments. Seneca began to practice at the bar at Rome, and was gaining considerable reputation, when in 41 he was banished to Corsica. 8 years later he was recalled to be tutor of the young Nero, then 11 years old. He was consul in 57, and during the first years of Nero's reign he shared the administration of affairs with the worthy Burrus. His influence over Nero, while it lasted, was salutary, though often maintained by doubtful means. In course of time Nero began to dislike him, and when Burrus died, his fate was sealed. By the Emperor's command he committed suicide. Opening the veins in his feet and arms, he discoursed with his friends on the brevity of life till death ensued. Seneca is the most eminent of the writers of his age. He wrote moral essays, philosophical letters, physical treatises, and tragedies. Of the last, the best are Hercules Furens, Phaedra, and Medea. Galba, 68 to 69, Otho, 69, Vitellius, 69. Galba entered the city as a conqueror without much trouble, but on account of his parsimony and austerity he soon became unpopular, and was murdered by his mutinous soldiers 15 days after he reached Rome. He belonged to an old patrician family, and his overthrow was sincerely regretted by the better element in the city. Otho, the first husband of Poppaea, and the leader in the insurrection against Galba, was now declared emperor. No sooner did the news of his accession reach Gaul than Vitellius, a general of the army of the Rhine, revolted. Otho marched against the rebels, was defeated, and committed suicide after a reign of 3 months. Vitellius had been a good soldier, but as a ruler he was weak and incapable. He was killed after a reign of less than a year, during which he had distinguished himself by gluttony and vulgar sensuality. End of chapter 38. End of section 15.